Story 1. At a quiet restaurant in central Turkey, a man seated us at a secluded table near the back, took our order, and soon delivered the food. About 30 minutes later we needed to pay, but we had not seen him in a while, so we went to the front and asked for the bill. The woman by the door was confused and surprised to see us leaving the restaurant. She was even more surprised when we tried to pay. She insisted that they had not prepared any food and that the man we described absolutely did not work there. We told her what we had ordered, pointed out where we had sat, and even ran back to grab the menu to confirm it was her restaurant. Meanwhile, she began bringing in other staff, who all denied they had served us, prepared any food, or knew who the man was. Neither we nor the restaurant staff had any idea where the man or the food had come from. We insisted on paying because we had definitely eaten, but they refused to charge us because they insisted they had not served us. Her English was excellent, so there was no translation issue. To this day, it is probably the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. Where did the food come from? The restaurant staff were as confused and bewildered as we were. Story 2. On my first day at an all-inclusive resort in Cancun, my waiter by the pool was an older man named Rene. We exchanged pleasantries. I spoke broken Spanish, and he spoke broken English. Later that day, after his shift, he brought over a sheet of paper to show me. He told me his daughter was graduating high school and would be the first in his family to go to college in the United States. To show how proud he was, he had written a speech in English and asked if I could help with grammar and pronunciation. Of course, I agreed. Rene served me all week. He practiced his speech each day and helped me with my Spanish. On our second to last day, I said, "Hasta mañana." He said, "No work tomorrow," speech, and grinned. I wished him luck, we shook hands, and went our separate ways. Story 3. On my flight from Chicago to Los Angeles, my seatmate was a very serious, unsmiling woman. She wore business clothes, had her hair in a bun, and appeared very stressed. We did not speak beyond saying hi when we sat down. After a week in Los Angeles, the same woman sat next to me on my return flight. This time she wore loose, flowery clothes, had her hair down, and had a serene smile. I said, "We flew in together. Did you have a good time in Los Angeles?" She smiled and said, "Oh yes." I did not pry, but I was happy for her. Story 4. I used to see a man I believe was South African waiting at my bus stop most mornings before college. He was so sweet. We talked every day, and on my birthday he gave me a rose. I am devastated that we never exchanged phone numbers, because one day he was simply not there. I wish I had been braver. Story 5. Security at the airport thought my partner might be a non-custodial adult trafficking a minor, me, across state lines. The SARSIR, they shouted at the security checkpoint, was so intense it is burned into my brain. For context, he is over 6 feet tall and I am not quite 5 feet 2. He was locked down so our faces were covered. We do not share the same last name, and I was letting him handle everything and not really engaging with the process because it was very early in the morning. I might actually have been in pajamas. Nothing happened in the end, but they pulled us to the side, made us take off our masks, and questioned us about our relationship. Then they looked at my identification and realized I was 33. I now take a more active role at the airport. Story 6. In Tokyo, an elderly man at a ramen shop saw me struggling with chopsticks. He silently got up from his meal, came over, repositioned my fingers, patted my shoulder, and then went back to eating. I think about him every time I use chopsticks. Story 7. I think I unintentionally triggered a woman's breakdown because I do not speak French. I am American and was in Bruges, Belgium, taking pictures when a woman, followed by her family dragging luggage, rushed up to me and started rapidly asking something in French. I managed to stutter that I did not speak French. She exclaimed, English, and laughed hysterically as she turned and walked back the way they had come, with her exhausted-looking family trudging behind. I still think about her sometimes. I hope they figured out whatever their problem was because she was clearly at her wit's end. Story 8. On holiday last year, we stayed on a very small Scottish island. The island was holding its annual ceilidh that night, so we went along, bought some raffle tickets, and won a voucher for a bouquet from the island florist. We were staying in a tiny camper van and had nowhere to put 20 pounds worth of flowers, so we asked her to give the bouquet to the community center as a thank you for all their help in finding us somewhere to park. She said she would. The next day there was a knock at the door of the van, and she had made us a small self-contained arrangement to take with us. That was so kind and typical of everyone we met. We will go back. Story 9. This was told before but is worth sharing again. When I visited Ukraine before the war, my fiancée and I went to a dog park very early one morning to walk her dog. We saw a man there, half naked, tied to a tree. He seemed to have a bit of dog waste on his face and chest, and a sign in Ukrainian above his head. I asked my fiancée, who said, "Oh, yep, that's an animal abuser. He's going to spend the whole day there and he's not going to like it." Both dog waste bins in the park were chained shut. The implication was clear. Her dog did not go, but as we were walking away, we saw an elderly woman with 2 German shepherds walking up to the offender with bags in hand. He cried and begged, but she calmly inverted each bag and smeared it all over his face and hair. He was covered. Those were the first big dogs of the day. There were 2 police cars in the lot as well, to ensure no one took it too far, my fiancé said. It was a semi-official ordeal. When we passed the park again in the afternoon out of morbid curiosity, he was completely covered and dripping, and flies were swarming him. Story 10. My soon-to-be ex-wife and I were in Munich for Oktoberfest. We arrived a few days early. This was around 11 p.m. We had had a few beers and were taking the train back to our rental. There was a group of young men and a few women in our car, along with others, about 8 to 10 people. They were arguing in another language and it was getting heated. Others in the car became uncomfortable. So I stood up and said, "Hey, everyone, calm down. We are all friends here. Let's be nice." My soon-to-be ex-wife thought we were in trouble. Immediately they all became respectful and were saying, "Sorry, Father. Yes, Father. Okay, Father." I wondered why they were calling me Father. I sat back down and they did the same. All was well. We got off a few stops later. When we did, my soon-to-be ex-wife burst out laughing. She said, "Look at you. That is why they called you Father." I was wearing a black jacket zipped almost all the way up with a white shirt underneath, so I really did look like a priest. We still laugh about it to this day. Story 11. When I was 15, my dad and I did a biking tour of the United Kingdom and dipped over to France so we could take a train to Paris. I had taken high school French and had a small translation dictionary. My dad did not speak French at all. We were both worried because of France's reputation toward tourists and people with poor French skills, but we found the exact opposite. People were overjoyed that I was trying to communicate in French, flipping through my little dictionary, and they went out of their way to help us. At one point we were at an intersection, on a small island between lanes on our bikes, looking at a map trying to find the hotel, when someone ran across 2 lanes of traffic to help us in broken English. Story 12. I took a trip to Las Vegas for a friend's unfortunate wedding. I started drinking at the airport and boarded a Southwest Airlines flight. A flight attendant asked if I minded sitting next to an unaccompanied minor, and I agreed. The girl sat next to me and immediately began talking. I was drinking beer, heading to what I thought was a bad idea wedding. She turned out to be very religious, and kept saying, "You sure drink a lot of beer, and you sure go to the bathroom a lot." She also said, "My banana can talk." She had drawn a face on a banana and split it so she could use it as a puppet. We experienced severe turbulence just before landing, and she took out a Bible and started reading aloud from the Book of Job. It was an interesting flight. The marriage ended within a year. Story 13. Most memorable? In the space of 40 minutes in a hotel lobby, waiting to call an Uber to the airport, I, in my 20s at the time, befriended a man in his late 70s who was waiting for his room to be ready. I had left my bag under the receptionist's watch while I stepped out for a cigarette. When I came back, this older gentleman was sitting by my things and said, "I kept an eye on them for you, free of charge." From there we started chatting. We went from complete strangers to crying in each other's arms within 40 minutes. We covered everything from wars in the Middle East to the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, to the ravages of dementia and the heartache of becoming your parents' caregiver. I never saw him again. We live on different continents, but we have emailed every Christmas for the 5 years since. I keep his business card tucked into my phone case. Or it could be my other experience. Meeting a man in his 70s who, while we were whitewater rafting on the Nile, asked, "Have you ever seen a 75-year-old do a backflip off a raft?" I said no. If you asked me that today, I would have to say yes. I very much have. Story 14. One night in Belize, I was alone and wandering, feeling kind of pissed off. A pack of dogs started following me and barked at anyone who came too close. For a brief time, I was king of the dogs. Story 15. I have a serious phobia of flying. I have done tons of research and I fly frequently, but I still have to take a beta blocker when I fly to prevent a full panic attack. For example, on one flight while on a beta blocker during takeoff before 10,000 feet, a flight attendant came to me because they thought I was having a seizure. On another flight, I was traveling from Reagan National Airport to Seattle. I mentioned my phobia to my seatmate to warn that if I acted oddly, it was because of my fear and there was nothing anyone could do. Mid-flight, a man from Australia in the row ahead asked to switch seats with the man next to me. He spent the whole flight talking to me, distracting me, and showing me photos of his family and pets. While that would usually annoy me, I do not know how to describe it. This man was so kind without being intrusive, and it helped a lot. I never got his name, but he made that flight much better. It was a very kind act by a stranger, and I will never forget him. Story 16. We were at a small airport in the District of Columbia, just 2 months after September 11, 2001. The doors did not open until 6 a.m., and we had an 8 a.m. flight. As we were going through security, just as the Transportation Security Administration was being implemented, they swabbed our bags. When the agent put the swab on the analyzer, it turned red and alarms sounded. People looked at us as if we were criminals. The woman was terrified and shaking badly. Security personnel responded quickly and treated us well. About 5 minutes later, the supervisor asked which swab she had used. She showed him and he shouted, "Who put these here? These are the testers." I will never forget January 10, 2002. The woman was allowed to take a break, and we received an apology and a note explaining that the test had left residue that a routine swab could detect. Story 17. I was on a long road trip with a friend to visit another friend. We stopped at a rest area to switch drivers, use the restroom, and stretch. An older woman approached me and gave us a bag of apples for the trip. I have no idea why she felt compelled to do so. Story 18. I was once driving from Florida to South Carolina for Christmas with my 4-year-old. There was a long stretch of Highway 301 that at the time was just barren, nothing for miles and miles. We were there when my son said he had to go potty. It was dark, and I did not want to stop on the side of the road. A single woman alone with a small child on an almost abandoned road. So I told him to try to hold it. Suddenly, a large United States of America gas station appeared on the opposite side of the road with nothing else in sight. We were out in the wilderness. There were no cars and only one employee. I thought, it was strange because I had driven that road many times and never seen that station. We got out, used the bathroom, bought some snacks, and got back on the road. Driving back home, I looked for that station, but it was not there. After that, I always looked for it. I stopped at a local store on the way home, just before I got to that stretch, and asked if anyone knew where the United States of America station on Highway 301 was. They all looked at me like I was crazy and said there had never been one out there. In fact, the closest United States of America station was about 40 miles behind me in another town. Story 19. I took a bunch of Xanax and had cocktails with another woman I had never met on a very long, turbulent flight. When we got off, we skipped arm in arm through the terminal, singing show tunes at the top of our lungs. Story 20. Barely 2 hours after we got off the plane in Ireland, we were walking to get breakfast when a woman's dog ran out into the street and was nearly hit by a car. When she got the dog back on the sidewalk, she yelled for fuck's sake, oodles, with the wonderful cadence of an Irish accent, and in that moment I knew I was going to love Ireland. Story 21. In the mid-1980s, I visited Izmir, Turkey. I was about 21. Clear and tinted contact lenses were all the rage in the United States. I had green eyes and wore aqua lenses that made them Kelly green. I walked toward the sunset, with the sunlight in my eyes. People passing me were dazzled and darted in front of me. So many people stood in front of me that I could not walk forward. A police officer pushed through the crowd holding what looked like a submachine gun. He looked into my eyes, chuckled, said green, and then pushed the crowd away. Story 22. I was traveling in Australia exactly 2 months after September 11, 2001, and staying in a hostel in Byron Bay. A woman from Gaza heard my accent, came over with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry your country was bombed. Are you okay?" I said I was fine. She then took both my hands, looked me straight in the eyes, and sang, "Let It Be." It was quite moving. Story 23. I was in London. I am a United States citizen and it was my first time leaving the country. I was with a girlfriend. It was about 2 in the morning and we were both very drunk after a day of walking the city and visiting random pubs. She wanted more wine and some snacks. I told her I would go and asked her to stay and get showered and comfortable, but I was not sure where to go. The wireless internet at the Airbnb was poor, so I went outside to see which way seemed busier. In my drunken mind, that meant there would be snacks and alcohol nearby. I saw a man smoking across the street and asked him if he knew where the nearest open store was. He told me how to get there and then asked if he should come with me. I said sure as long as he did not poke, prick, or stab me. We ended up smoking a spliff on the way to the store. When I got back to the Airbnb, I shook his hand and thanked him. He said anything for an innocent wanderer and walked off. I went against everything my parents told me not to do, but I still think of that from time to time. Story 24. 2 years after graduating, I ran into a girl who graduated with me in the crowd at the Trevi Fountain in Rome. My graduating class had 120 students at a boarding school in the middle of nowhere, halfway across the world. The chances were incredible considering how crowded it was with tourists. I have not seen or heard from her since that day. We both have very common names, so she is impossible to find online. Story 25. I was an au pair in Paris when I was 20. The family I lived with, who were Jewish, took me to a huge outdoor celebration for Rosh Hashanah. Hundreds of people in the dimming light of a warm September evening on a Paris street. Lanterns, music, singing, laughter. It was incredible. Through the crowd, I caught the eye of the most beautiful young man I had ever seen. He was tall and slim and looked like a figure from a Renoir painting. He moved through the throng to me, kissed me on the lips, and then disappeared into it. Not a word was spoken. It was without a doubt the most romantic moment of my life. Story 26. Many years ago, when I was in my 20s, I was walking home down a very busy road that ends at a petrol station. I am a fairly large guy, both in height and weight, so I tend not to worry about things like getting jumped. As I got to the petrol station, someone shouted to me from the pumps where his van was parked. It was early afternoon and there were lots of people around. My father knows many people, so I presumed it was one of his friends who recognized me, but I did not personally know him. I am also terrible at remembering people's names and faces, so I did not think much of it. I walked over to the parked van. He was sitting in the driver's seat, so nothing shady was going on. He asked me to read a text message off his phone out loud because he could not read it on his screen due to poor eyesight. It turned out he did not know me at all. He had seen me walking and thought I would read it for him. As strange as it seemed, I was already there, so I did it. I read his message aloud. He said, "Okay, thanks, mate." Then he drove away and I walked off. Very random and strange. I must just have a face that says I will help. Story 27. We were traveling by air as a family of 5 the summer after my son's first year of college. In line for security, a police officer and a dog walked by. After they passed, the dog returned to sniff my son's bag. I was freaking out inside but kept a calm exterior. I asked if there was any food in the bag, and my son said he had beef and cheese sticks. The officer laughed and said the dog always wants a treat, which eased one of the scariest moments of my life. Story 28. When I lived in Istanbul, I went to a barber shop. After they found out I was from Canada, they smoked marijuana with me in the back room after my shave, and I was extremely surprised because marijuana is highly illegal there. Story 29. I was foolishly late for a flight from Atlanta to Denver. I had wanted to pick up some bud from a friend in Columbus, Georgia. I arrived at the check-in counter and was told I had to reschedule. The next flight was not until 7 p.m. the following day. I had arrived at the airport at 5:45 p.m. I freaked. What was I going to do at an airport in Atlanta for more than 24 hours? I hung out at the International House of Pancakes Express. I could only afford $2 worth of internet at the time, so I was not scrolling social media to kill time. I made conversation here and there until I met a woman who asked to use my phone to call her ex. She had also been late to her flight to Denver from Atlanta because she had been drinking on the beach and missed the ship. I was a mess. I let her use my phone and my limited internet to make calls and send messages as she tried to find someone to pay for a hotel room. I sat quietly while she networked and drank International House of Pancakes Express coffee. She leaned over and asked, "Do you have a debit or credit card?" I said, "Yes, but I'm broke." She said, "Great. We just need one on file for the DoubleTree." The DoubleTree? I thought the place was fancy even in a crisis. She excitedly told me that an ex had gotten us a hotel room for the night because he did not want us sleeping in the most unsafe part of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. So we had beds and safety. I was grateful. I do not remember her name, but I started working on a hemp bracelet while she rinsed off in the shower. She came out with a towel on her head and asked if I wanted to do guided meditation with her. I was clearly flabbergasted and politely declined. I thought, I missed my flight, blew my high, and broke my 48-pound suitcase. I'm just trying to chill and get home, but thank you. She finished winding down. I put my bracelet supplies away, and she rolled over and said, "I exotic dance in Denver. If you're ever in town, we should party together. You're such a blast." I felt flattered and told her I would contact her on Facebook since we had become friends. I woke her up for her flight, gave her my last $10 so she could get coffee and toast at the International House of Pancakes Express, and saw her out. She ended up getting pregnant shortly after we met and became a professional photographer. It was a crazy day that ended with two weird strangers helping each other get to the next checkpoint. Kind of cool. Story 30. I left my suitcase in an Italian taxi, and they brought it back to the hotel for me. Story 31. Once in Morocco, a little boy asked if I wanted to trade my sneakers for his pet chameleon. For 5 minutes, I seriously considered it. Story 32. My wife and I had taken a taxi back from Abu Dhabi. We told the driver to let us out at the first convenient metro station, and we would take the train back to the hotel. He did so, we paid, and he drove off. It turned out the metro station was still under construction, which we did not realize until we tried to get in. One of the site foremen saw us. This was around 8 in the evening. He offered to give us a lift, and suddenly we were bouncing over the dunes in his utility vehicle, with all sorts of tools hanging from the back wall and bouncing around. Story 33. I was misdiagnosed in my mid-20s. I developed symptoms related to lupus and falsely tested positive in a blood test. I was put on many medications and told there was no cure and that I should get medical aid as soon as possible. I had arranged to travel through Europe by myself before all this, so I went alone, scared, and thinking I was going to die. I felt very vulnerable and could not think how I would cope. I caught a bug on the plane that after a day turned into an agonizing ear infection. In Innsbruck, Austria, I set off to find a doctor. As I walked miserably down the high street, I saw a figure ahead of me. He stood in the flow of people, looking down the road toward me. People walked past and smiled. Some turned to see what he was looking at. As I approached, I smiled too. His face was radiant, joyful, and filled with compassion. He opened his arms, and I walked into his embrace. We hugged for a moment. Then he looked into my eyes, turned me slightly, and kicked me on my bottom. Instantly, I realized I had been doing this to myself and that I could change the outcome. I remembered my yoga teacher had said that we are all each other's angels. I changed things in my life and my symptoms disappeared. It was an amazing experience. Story 34. In 2004, I lived in Seattle for 5 weeks. I have never seen so many men with gray beards. I thought they were all trying to look like the Gorton's fishermen. Story 35. I am an Arizona Cardinals fan and season ticket holder. In 2016, I was in Florence, Italy on vacation, and that Sunday was the opening day of the National Football League season. I decided to represent Arizona and wore my Larry Fitzgerald jersey. While wandering around the Pitti Palace, I heard people loudly whispering, "Cardinals, Cardinals." I turned and saw a pleasant older couple who asked, "Are you a Cardinals fan?" I replied that I was a season ticket holder. They said, "Oh my God, so are we." What are the odds I would run into one of the very few other Cardinals season ticket holders who were not at the game, 5,000 miles from home? Story 36. I saw Eminem serving spaghetti to people at his restaurant in Detroit. Story 37. I once walked to the store 5 minutes from my house by the ocean and locked eyes with a seal on the shore. The seal lifted its flipper and waved. I waved back. Story 38. Wherever you are, naked and homeless, dancing like a ballerina in the heavy rain downtown, I hope you have received help. Story 39. In 2022, I traveled to Nashville and attended a concert at the Ryman Auditorium. According to the artist, masks were still required. I had been wearing a mask for work and thought nothing of it. It had been a normal part of my routine for over 2 years. After the show, I walked to a nearby bar. 30 seconds after I entered, 2 large men approached me from either side and asked, "Why are you wearing a mask?" I said I needed it for the place next door, removed the mask, and left quickly. The goddamn South. Story 40. This happened many years ago when I was 15. My family and I took a road trip through the mountains and stopped for the night at a motel in a fairly remote area. Wanting a little time outside and to sneak a smoke, I walked to the swimming pool cabin just out of sight of my parents and sat on a bench. It was early fall. The pool was closed and the motel was not very busy. A couple of minutes later, a very attractive young woman, probably in her late teens, beelined for me and sat right beside me on the bench, only a few inches away. I shifted over and she shifted with me. She asked me for a cigarette and then talked to me as if we were old friends, though we were strangers. She was the kind of beauty an average guy like me could never speak to. I was shy and kept my head down, but she reached over, put her hand on my jaw, turned my head toward hers, and told me not to be shy. She said I should feel confident and hold my head high. She spoke well and made an impression on me. After a while, she said the police were transferring her because they had to be in court the next morning and pointed to a police car parked about 100 feet away. I asked if they were worried she might run, and she said she had given her word and they trusted her. She admitted she liked smoking marijuana and that was what had gotten her in trouble. After she finished her cigarette, I saw one of the officers waving her over. As she left, she told me her room number but said I would have to come in through the bathroom window. I never visited her. This happened 45 years ago, but I have always wondered what became of her. She had such a presence and an ability to communicate. She left a lasting impression. Story 41. I saw a family recreational vehicle careen off the road and into a cliffside. Dozens of cars pulled over and people tried to help while waiting. I chatted with a little girl, maybe 4 to 6 years old. Her blonde hair had dried blood in it. She loved Shrek, and they were returning from Wisconsin Dells. Once the emergency medical technician and fire department arrived, I passed along the information I had learned from her and left to get out of their way. The octogenarian with road rage flipped me off and then motioned as if his middle finger were a penis and he was performing oral sex. I think he was just trying to be obscene to offend me, but it was hilarious. Story 42. When I was in Italy, a stranger helped me carry my heavy luggage up a long flight of stairs at the train station. He smiled and disappeared before I could even say thank you. I still think about that random act of kindness every time I travel abroad. Story 43. Stuck in a traffic jam in Italy, our taxi driver kept yelling "Mamma Mia." We felt like we were in a bad Saturday Night Live sketch. Story 44. I was on a solo trip and trying to unplug from work, but I forgot to turn off notifications. I ended up debugging a small back-end issue for a client while sitting on a train through the Swiss Alps. using hotel wireless internet via a hotspot I had used at a cafe the night before, running code in Replit on my phone and pasting logs into Slack while pretending to take panoramic shots. The client never knew. My friends still joke it was the most scenic emergency patch ever. Story 45. Hello everyone. I am a man. I was traveling to Brazil on vacation and planned to stay for 2 weeks. On the trip back to Uruguay, my native country, an 11-year-old boy approached me and asked, "Sir, how do you use a condom?" He handed me one. I was surprised because I did not know him. His mother came to pick him up, and I never saw him again. Story 46. I was in Croatia on vacation with my mom and my sister. On the first evening, we went for a walk because the town had many stands and bars. It was a popular resort town. We found a stand selling chocolate-covered donut holes. They were so tasty that we returned every evening of our stay to buy them. The stand was run by an elderly couple and their grandson, and we could barely communicate how many kunas we owed. They were so kind and cheerful that we kept coming back. On the last evening, my mom finally mustered the courage to ask the grandmother for the recipe. They could not speak our languages and Google Translate was not helping. I asked the grandson if he spoke English. He said yes. What followed was a lengthy process of translating the recipe from Croatian to English and then to Slovak. My mom bought 2 bottles of their homemade olive oil, even though it was expensive, and tipped the grandmother to show our gratitude. Story 47. When I visited Tallinn, I went out with some people from my hostel. I met a musician who was famous in Estonia, to the extent that Estonians were a bit starstruck. He was with a British ex-cop turned anarchist. We got very drunk and sang karaoke together all night. I should have asked for their names. They were awesome. Story 48. I was in Amsterdam and asked if the next train was going to Schiphol Airport, but the station worker would only answer if I used a long litany of superlatives to ingratiate him. It was way over the top. On a more positive note, when we went to the Belgian Grand Prix, my dad left his walking stick in the hotel. The travel company arranged a taxi to bring it to the train station for us. Story 49. My final night solo traveling in New Zealand, some guys I had made friends with said there would be a folk music session in the pub across the road from my hostel that night, but they were not sure if it would be my thing. I assured them that with a whole master's degree in Celtic traditional music, it definitely was my thing. I turned up and there was a Canadian woman playing the violin. We had a weird, "I know you from somewhere" moment and finally realized that we had already met once before in Mid-Wales a couple of years earlier while she was traveling there. And there we were, halfway around the world, randomly meeting again. Just one of those moments that makes you realize it really is a small world and that we are all going about our lives crossing paths with each other. A similar thing happened when a temporary worker showed up at my job. We spent all morning trying to place how we knew each other, only to finally realize we had met in some nightclub toilets in Cyprus a few years before. Story 50. Summary. I accidentally smuggled a 4-inch foldable knife onto a flight. I was chatting with the man scanning bags as my carry-on went through the scanner. I had completely forgotten I left a 4-inch foldable knife in my bag. No one noticed because I was distracting the one man who was supposed to be checking the bags. After my bag was scanned, I went through the metal detector with no incident, but I was randomly pulled aside and given a very aggressive pat-down. I was 17 years old at the time and had no idea what to expect. I stood there with my hands out as directed. He patted my left arm, then my right arm. Then the security officer slapped my chest with both palms so hard it knocked me back a step. He immediately yelled at me to stand still. The aggressiveness of the pat-down is comical because I had a 4-inch knife in my carry-on. Story 51. I took a bus across the country when I was 19. An old man wanted me to sit in the back with him and share his booze. I refused, obviously. Story 52. In 1999, my husband, 2 other couples, and I were at Beijing Airport on our way to another city to adopt our daughters. All the announcements were in Chinese, and we were unsure if we were at the right gate. A middle-aged Chinese man in a loud sports jacket noticed our confusion and panic and gestured to us when our flight was called, leading us onto the plane. He was nowhere to be seen during the flight. It was not a big plane and that jacket was very colorful. I honestly believe he was an angel. Story 53. I was in Paraguay for a summer student exchange. A local kept staring at me, which made me uncomfortable until he said I looked almost exactly like one of their news broadcasters. I was 16, a slightly goofy-looking girl, so that surprised me. He did not bother me after telling me that. Story 54. I met Charlie Trotter at his restaurant in Chicago before he passed away. In 2010, my family and I visited Japan and were in Hiroshima looking for a ramen shop when some schoolgirls offered to help us. Their English was excellent, and I recall at least one of them planned to go into medicine. Story 55. I was in a small tourist shop in France when a woman became upset and started ranting in French. She looked right at me expecting an answer, and I didn't want to seem like a dumb American tourist. So in my best Spanish, I said, "No comprendo." Forgetting my basic conjugations, sounding totally fed up, she threw her arms in the air, exclaimed, "Ah, Italiano," and stormed off. Story 56. I keep looking for Greyhound stories. I took the Greyhound right after college when I was in a long-distance relationship. The trip from New York City to Washington, District of Columbia, always carried interesting conversations with vagabonds and people on a spiritual precipice. I talked to a man for several hours once, a middle-aged, slim man in navy sweatpants who had gone off all substances, including pain medication, caffeine, and sugar. He thought I was an angel. I talked to another man for several hours, a young, round-faced man in a cowboy hat, about what he was searching for, purpose, and about what I was searching for, which I do not remember at the time. I enjoyed the way people would pour their stories out if someone would listen. Another time I was taking a train to see a man I was obsessed with, but the relationship had a clear expiration date. I was a wreck and sobbing on the phone to my little brother. It was clear that everyone could hear and was trying to be polite. I asked my brother if they still had half-fat, double-stuffed Oreos at home. He said yes. I sniffled the word awesome, and the people around me giggled. Story 57. When I was in high school, I went on a family trip to Italy. On our way back, we had a long layover in Paris and were exploring the airport when a Chinese couple came up to us and started speaking in panicked Mandarin. My family is ethnically Chinese but only speaks Cantonese, the Toisin and Hong Kong varieties. I had taken Mandarin in school, so I was the only one who understood enough to get the gist of what they were saying. They were having a problem with their luggage and wanted us to help them talk to an airport employee, possibly a customs officer. We had plenty of time and there were no other English-speaking Chinese people offering to help, so I decided to try. They brought us to the man they were having trouble with, an older French man who seemed nice. He asked me a question in French. I do not speak French. I asked if he spoke English. He said no. I then asked if he spoke Italian because I had also taken Italian in school, and it was worth a shot. He said yes. That began an hour-long ordeal of me, a native English speaker, translating the man's Italian into Mandarin for the couple and vice versa. I had to look up a lot of words. In the end, the problem was solved. I do not remember the details exactly, but it involved items they had bought at the duty-free shops, possibly exceeding a limit. The Chinese woman gave me a big hug. It is the most helpful I have ever felt, to be honest. My family still talks about it sometimes. Story 58. A couple from airports. I was waiting at the gate near some military personnel who were discussing physical training. I do not remember all the specifics, but one line remains burned in my memory. "How many times do we have to tell you, man? Jacking off in the head does not count as physical training." Another time, back in the days of portable digital music players, I was headed through security. One of the Transportation Security Administration agents had some of the best instruction patter I have ever heard, ending with, "Please make sure all of your electronic devices are removed and ready to go through the scanner. The scanner will not cause any harm or data loss, except erasing Justin Bieber songs. We consider that a public service." Story 59. I got very drunk trying wines at a local restaurant my airbed and breakfast had recommended. I set out the next morning still a bit sozzled, and by the end of the tour I had booked I was desperate for painkillers. I was well outside the tourist area where I could not rely on a common language and ended up in a pharmacy, holding my head and counting on my fingers. 1 Vinho, 2, 3, for Vinho. The amused clerk took out her phone and used Google Translate. You had too much wine and want painkillers. I will also sell you this liter of water. Drink all of it. And stop petting the street cats while you are drunk. 4 euros. Delightful 10 out of 10 interaction. Story 60. I was in San Francisco for work, walking past a hospital after a meeting, when I saw a man in his 70s struggling to walk with crutches while balancing a box. I offered to help and he handed me the box. It turned out he had made a birthday cake for his oldest friend, who was in the hospital. I walked with him into the hospital and up to his friend's room, where he joyfully presented the cake. They insisted I share the cake and drink some acai juice his daughter had brought. After visiting for a while, we learned we all had a mutual connection to the city where I lived at the time. It was an unlikely experience and one of my fondest memories of a random connection on the road. Story 61. I don't know if it's just mental, but when I left the countryside and went into the city, everyone seemed like zombies. When I was a kid, people acted brain dead and showed no emotion. Story 62. I was flying and had an aisle seat with the tray down and a cup of water resting on it. The gentleman in the middle seat told me he had to use the bathroom, then reached over and grabbed my cup by the rim so his fingers touched it. He held it there, presumably waiting for me to close my tray and take it from him. I looked at him and said that it was his cup of water now. He stared at me, dumbfounded, and did not understand why I would not want to drink from a cup he had handled. Story 63. My first time aboard a bus at age 8, after missing a train, I was nervous because I had mistakenly come to believe that buses were only for strange, creepy, poor people. That first impression was unfortunate. An odd fellow in a dirty t-shirt with a half-shaved head down the middle introduced himself as Monkey Steve and offered me a banana when he learned it was my first time on a bus. It scared me off buses for another 8 or so years, and I do not even like bananas. Story 64. I once missed my bus, and a stranger gave me a ride 2 hours out of their way without asking for anything. We barely spoke the same language, but we shared snacks and music. It was one of those small human connections that sticks with you. Sometimes the kindness of random people is the best memory you take home. Story 65. I was hitchhiking on the Colorado Plateau when some German tourists in a rental car picked me up on the Navajo Nation. They had just been to the Grand Canyon South Rim and were heading for Lake Powell. After that, they planned to return to Las Vegas. I went with them to Lake Powell and then took them to Zion National Park, which they had not planned to visit. They were amazed and very grateful that I showed it to them. I am in their photos in Germany as the person who showed them Zion. Story 66. A parrot in a small cafe in Mexico kept saying, "Hola, amigo," until I left. I still think about that parrot. Story 67. My husband and I were sitting and eating sandwiches late at night in a small area near Friedrichstrasse station when we noticed 2 men arguing by the station entrance. They were shouting in German and looked very upset. One man was holding a large pretzel when the other grabbed it and slapped him so hard with it that the pretzel flew across the street. Story 68. At a German airport, Chinese people came up and asked me something in German. I said I only speak English and they walked away. A man who looked like Santa, sitting next to me, said he wanted to practice his English with me. He pulled out a bottle of Jägermeister, offered me some, and we talked for a bit. At Dubai Mall, a girl wearing a full abaya with her mother thought I was Elsa and yelled, crying, as her mother dragged her away. Story 69. I ran into someone I know 2,000 miles from home, and a few years later I ran into the same person again 4,000 miles from home. I do not think anyone would believe me if I had not been with my family both times. Story 70. Once, when I was traveling with my family in Spain, I got separated from them for about 10 minutes. I saw a group of people in costumes, thought they looked fun, and walked with them. My family found me afterward. My mom was mad but also impressed. I somehow ended up in all the tourist photos that day. I was about 12 then. Story 71. It is not the strangest or most memorable, but I still think about it because it happened so many times. People ask me where I am from, and I usually say America, Texas, or the city where I grew up. A while back I realized that was not what they were asking. I should have answered that I am Chinese or that I am from China, even though I was not born there. Story 72. I was working on a music tour in 2005, and we stopped at a gas station in Kansas. I went inside to get a pack of cigarettes and handed the cashier my identification. She said in a surprised, amused voice, "You're from California? What are you doing way out here?" It reminds me of how big the world and our country used to feel before the spread of the internet. Story 73. I was doing karaoke in K. Cocker, singing Only Girl in the World. A woman on a bike stopped dead to see who was singing. It was flattering, and yes, I can sing. Story 74. So many. I'm thinking of the stories I retell the most. For some reason, they mostly seem to revolve around food. My wife and I were traveling around New York State. We were staying in a small town called Keene. On the way back from our day trip, we pulled into the Keene Valley General Store to grab a liter of milk for breakfast. I had been doing all the driving, so my wife said she would run in while I rested. She returned too quickly and said with a big grin, "Are you in a hurry?" I knew that if I were in a hurry, I should not be. It seemed the owner of the store had felt like barbecuing pork ribs, so he had put them in the barbecue 6 hours earlier and they would be ready in 20 minutes, if I did not mind waiting. We grabbed them and a pile of napkins, drove a kilometer up the road to the nearest parking lot, and gobbled them up. Or the time we were lost somewhere east of Cleveland trying to find the interstate after spending the night at a campground. We passed a farm stand and my wife suggested we stop and stock up on some fresh vegetables. She came back a few minutes later carrying 2 pies. It seemed the owner's grandmother had baked pies using the less-than-perfect fruit. She said, "Oh no, honey. These are fresh out of the oven. Too hot for me to sell you." My wife replied in a way that implied fairly strongly, "Just give me the pies and nobody gets hurt." We ate one of those pies right there in the parking lot, straight out of the box. Story 75. Did the same strange thing happen to someone else? Or was it just me? Story 76. I had sex with the flight attendant in the lavatory. It was a red-eye flight and there were not many passengers. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.